The weight of tomorrow. The morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting golden streaks across the living room. Rachel sat on the edge of the couch, her hands clutching a warm mug of coffee. The quiet hum of the neighborhood waking up played in the background. The occasional bark of a dog, the distant rumble of a garbage truck, and the faint melody of children laughing on their way to school. Before entering the story, please subscribe to help TMY Stories reach 1,000 subscribers. She glanced toward the staircase, waiting for the sound of 13-year-old Micah's hurried footsteps. It was a familiar morning ritual, her son rushing to eat breakfast and tie his sneakers before the school bus honked its impatient horn. But this morning, the weight on Rachel's chest was heavier than usual. Last night's news replayed in her mind. Another young black boy just a year older than Micah, shot in a park not far from here. The image of the boy's mother sobbing at a vigil haunted her. Rachel could almost feel the pain in her cries, an anguish that echoed the fears tucked deep in her own heart. She knew the script well, how the world judged boys like Micah before they even spoke. His lanky frame, deep brown skin, and untamed curls would to some be a threat before a promise. She'd fought tirelessly to shield him from the world's unfairness, but no amount of love or wisdom could change what lay outside their front door. "Mom, have you seen my math notebook?" Micah's voice broke her thoughts. He bounded down the stairs, his backpack slung loosely over one shoulder. Rachel smiled faintly. "Check the dining table. You left it there last night." Micah darted into the next room, and Rachel studied him as he passed. The earnest determination in his stride, the carefree confidence of someone not yet aware of all the world's sharp edges. He was a bright boy, curious and kind. But she worried. How long before he started shrinking under the weight of others' expectations? When would he notice the double takes, the clutched purses, the whispers? Micah reappeared, clutching the notebook triumphantly. "Found it." His grin lit up the room, and Rachel couldn't help but chuckle. "You're always losing things," she teased. "Not always." He shot back, his eyes twinkling. Then, more serious, he added, "Are you okay, Mom? You look worried." Rachel hesitated, surprised by his perceptiveness. "I'm fine, baby," she said, brushing his cheek lightly. "Just grown-up stuff." Micah nodded, accepting the explanation. "You sure?" "I'm sure. Now eat something before you miss the bus." He grabbed a granola bar from the counter and waved as he headed out the door. Rachel watched him through the window, her heart swelling with love and trepidation. He was still so innocent, so unaware of the world's cruel judgments. But how long could she keep him safe? Later that evening, Rachel sat at the kitchen table with her best friend, Anaya. The two women shared a bond forged through years of shared triumphs and tears. Tonight, Anaya's presence felt like a lifeline. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," Rachel admitted, her voice low. "Every time Micah leaves the house, I feel like I'm holding my breath until he comes back." Anaya nodded, her face shadowed with understanding. She had two sons of her own, both in their 20s. "It doesn't get easier, Rach. You can't let fear control you. You've got to arm him with strength and wisdom. Teach him to navigate this world without losing himself." Rachel sighed. "I want to, but how do I tell him to stay proud of who he is, while also teaching him to be careful? I don't want him to think he has to dim his light just to stay safe." Anaya reached across the table, squeezing Rachel's hand. "You start by showing him what resilience looks like. You can't protect him from everything, but you can prepare him. And you remind him, every single day, that he's loved." That night, as Rachel tucked Micah into bed, she lingered for a moment. His face was serene, his breathing steady. She leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Mom?" he murmured sleepily. "Yes, baby?" "Why do you worry about me so much?" Rachel hesitated, the lump in her throat rising. Finally she whispered, "Because you're my heart, Micah, and hearts need protecting." He smiled faintly, his eyes already drifting shut. "Don't worry, Mom, I'm tough." Rachel smiled through the tears that blurred her vision. "Yes, you are," she said softly, "and you're going to change the world someday." As she turned off the light and closed his door, Rachel stood in the hallway for a moment, steadying herself. She didn't have all the answers, but tonight she resolved to be the anchor Micah needed. Whatever storms lay ahead, she would face them, one step at a time. Lessons in the park. The weekend brought a welcome break from the hustle of school and work. Rachel and Micah walked hand in hand to Westwood Park, their Saturday morning ritual. The path was lined with golden leaves, the trees slowly surrendering to autumn. Micah carried a basketball under one arm, his long legs skipping every few steps as excitement bubbled within him. "Think you can take me today, old lady?" Micah teased, grinning as he glanced at Rachel. Rachel smirked. "Watch yourself, kid. I've still got a mean jump shot." They reached the court where the familiar sounds of bouncing basketballs and sneakers squeaking on pavement filled the air. It was busy, as usual, kids forming makeshift teams, parents chatting on benches, and couples strolling along the edges of the park. But Rachel couldn't help scanning the crowd, her eyes flitting over unfamiliar faces, cataloging any potential danger. Micah pulled her to the free side of the court, already dribbling the ball. "Come on, Mom, 1st to 10 wins." Rachel laughed, letting herself relax for the moment. "All right, show me what you've got." The game was lighthearted at first, with Micah showing off exaggerated moves, pivoting like a pro while Rachel made exaggerated defenses. By the time the score hit 8-8, the competition had heated up. Micah faked left, crossed the ball to his right, and drove to the hoop. He missed. Rachel rebounded and sprinted toward the other end of the court. "Mom, you didn't even call a foul," Micah protested, chasing after her. "No excuses, Micah," Rachel teased as she released the ball. It soared through the air, hitting the rim before dropping through the net. Micah groaned dramatically, throwing himself onto the pavement. "I can't believe this," Rachel laughed, extending a hand to pull him up. "Better luck next time, champ." They walked to the bench, Rachel grabbing a water bottle from her bag. Micah sat beside her, catching his breath, his face flushed with effort. "Mom," he said after a pause, "why do you always check the crowd when we're out?" Rachel froze, the question catching her off guard. She hadn't realized how obvious her vigilance had become. Micah shrugged. "Yeah, I guess, but sometimes I notice things, like how you're always watching, or how you get quiet when we pass the cops." Rachel looked at him, her heart aching at his innocence and awareness all at once. "I watch because I love you, baby, and because I need to be sure you're safe. There's a lot of good in the world, but there are also things I can't always control. People who might see you differently just because of how you look." Micah frowned, his gaze shifting to the kids playing on the court. "That's not fair." "No, it's not," Rachel said softly. "But what I want you to remember is this. You're not what the world says you are. You're kind, brilliant, and strong. Don't ever forget that." Micah was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing patterns in the dirt. "What about when I grow up? Won't I be, scary to people, like Dad says?" Rachel inhaled sharply. She hated the thought of Micah feeling like his mere existence could ever be a threat. "Your dad means well," she said carefully. "But being scary isn't who you are, Micah. You don't have to change yourself to make other people comfortable. What you need to do is be aware. Stay smart, stay respectful, and always stay true to who you are." Micah nodded, the weight of her words settling on him. "So, like I have to prove myself?" Rachel sighed. "No, baby. You don't have to prove anything to anyone, but you do have to protect yourself, and that starts with knowing your worth and making smart choices." Later that afternoon, as they walked home, Micah grew quieter, lost in thought. Rachel wondered if she'd said too much, burdened him with fears he wasn't ready to face. "Mom," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Yeah? When I grow up, I want to be a scientist," he said firmly. "Like the ones in those space books I read. I want to figure out stuff no one else knows." Rachel smiled, relief washing over her. "You can be anything you want, Micah. A scientist, a writer, even a basketball star." Micah grinned. "Not a basketball star. I've seen your moves. I'd lose to you every time." Rachel laughed, ruffling his hair. "Good choice, then." As they approached their front door, Rachel glanced down at Micah. Despite the weight of their earlier conversation, his spirit was unshaken, his confidence intact. She promised herself she'd do whatever it took to keep it that way. "Come on," she said, unlocking the door. "Let's see if you can help me with dinner tonight. Consider it a lesson in being a scientist of the kitchen." Micah groaned playfully. "Fine, but I'm not washing the dishes." "Deal," Rachel said, pulling him into a hug before they stepped inside. For now, they had this moment. Just the two of them, safe and together. Shadows of the past, Rachel didn't sleep much that night. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock in the hallway. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind swirling with thoughts of Micah's questions from the park. He was asking more now, piecing together the fragments of things he'd overheard, the unspoken rules she and his father had always tried to shield him from. She knew the time was coming when their conversations would need to go deeper. She dreaded it. Not because she didn't know what to say, but because she didn't want to extinguish the light in his eyes. She thought about her own parents, the lessons they had passed down to her, and how those lessons often came wrapped in fear and warnings. Rachel sighed and rolled over, reaching for her phone. She swiped through her contacts until she landed on a familiar name, Caleb, Micah's father. She hesitated before pressing the call button. The phone rang twice before his deep voice answered. "Hey, Rach. Everything okay?" "Yeah," Rachel said, though her voice betrayed her worry. It's just, I wanted to talk about Micah. He's been asking a lot of questions lately. About, the world, how people see him. Caleb was silent for a moment. Yeah, I figured this would start soon. He's getting older, Rach. The world's gonna start treating him like he's older too. That's what scares me, Rachel admitted. He's still just a boy, Caleb. How do we explain all this without crushing him? Caleb sighed. We don't have a choice, Rachel. You know that. It's better if it comes from us than from some cop or teacher or stranger who doesn't care about him. We've got to give him the tools to protect himself. Rachel closed her eyes, tears stinging the corners. She hated that Caleb was right. Can you talk to him? She asked. I mean, really talk to him, man to man. Of course, Caleb said. Let's do something this weekend. I'll take him to the barber shop. You know that's a good place for these talks. Rachel smiled faintly. Caleb had always loved the barber shop, calling it the black man's sanctuary. It was a place where stories, wisdom, and community were shared freely. Thanks, Caleb, she said. I want him to grow up strong, but not afraid. He will, Rach, Caleb assured her. He's got both of us. We'll figure it out. The barber shop was buzzing with energy Saturday morning. The hum of clippers, the banter between barbers and customers, and the faint smell of hair oil filled the air. Micah followed Caleb into the shop, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. All right, Micah, Caleb said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. This is where real men come to talk and get fresh. You ready for that? Micah grinned. I guess. Caleb led him to an empty chair where his longtime barber, Mr. Rowland, greeted them with a warm smile. Look at this young man, Mr. Rowland said, clapping Caleb on the back. Growing up so fast, what are we doing today, little man? Just a lineup, Caleb said, ruffling Micah's curls. As Mr. Rowland got to work, Caleb pulled up a chair next to Micah. The shop's chatter swirled around them, talk of sports, politics, and neighborhood news. Micah listened intently, his head tilting as if trying to absorb it all. When Mr. Rowland stepped away to grab a new set of clippers, Caleb leaned in closer. So, Micah, your mom says you've been asking some big questions lately. Micah's cheeks flushed slightly. Yeah, I guess. Like what? Caleb pressed. Micah hesitated, then blurted, Why does everyone think I'll be dangerous when I grow up? Like, just because I look like this? The shop quieted slightly, a few heads turning their way. Caleb didn't flinch. That's a big question, Micah, Caleb said. But I'm glad you asked it. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Here's the thing. The world isn't fair, and some people will judge you without even knowing you. They'll see your skin, your size, and think they know your whole story. But they don't. Micah's brows furrowed. So what do I do? You stay smart, Caleb said firmly. You stay respectful, but don't let anyone make you feel small. You carry yourself with pride, and you remember this. Your worth isn't up for debate. Not by anyone. Micah nodded slowly. But what if someone tries to hurt me anyway? Like on the news? Caleb's jaw tightened. That's why I'm here, son. To teach you how to handle yourself. To keep you safe. And if something ever feels wrong, you come to me or your mom. You don't ever have to deal with it alone. The shop had grown quieter, the weight of the conversation settling in the air. Mr. Rowland spoke up then, his voice steady and warm. Micah, let me tell you something, he said. Being a young black man is tough, but it's also powerful. You've got a history of kings, inventors, and warriors running through your veins. Don't let this world make you forget that. Micah looked up at the older man, his eyes wide with wonder. Really? Really, Mr. Rowland said, giving him a wink. That evening, as Caleb dropped Micah back at Rachel's house, he pulled her aside. He's asking the right questions, Caleb said, and I think he's starting to understand. But we've got to keep building him up, Rach, every day. Rachel nodded, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. Thank you, Caleb. I couldn't do this without you. You don't have to, he said simply. Inside, Micah sat at the kitchen table, flipping through one of his space books. Rachel joined him, running a hand through his curls. How was the barber shop? She asked. Good, Micah said, looking up at her. Dad and Mr. Rowland told me I'm part of something big, like history and stuff. Rachel smiled. That's because you are. Never forget that. Micah grinned, a spark of confidence in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Rachel held on to that spark, determined to keep it alive for as long as she could. The rules of the game. The following week, Rachel sat on the sidelines of Micah's basketball practice. The squeak of sneakers on polished wood and the rhythmic bounce of the ball filled the gym. Parents sat scattered along the bleachers, some chatting while others kept their eyes glued to their phones. Rachel watched Micah weave through his teammates, his intensity growing as he learned to anticipate their movements. Micah's got good instincts, Coach Daniels called out, his whistle hanging loosely around his neck. Keep it up, kid. Rachel smiled at the praise, but her gaze lingered on her son. There was a fire in him when he played, a drive to excel, to prove himself. It was a quality she loved, but one that also worried her. How would that determination translate in a world that sometimes saw confidence as arrogance and ambition as defiance? Her thoughts were interrupted when a familiar voice called her name. Rachel. She turned to see Anaya climbing the bleachers, balancing 2 cups of coffee in her hands. "I thought I'd find you here," Anaya said, handing Rachel one of the cups as she sat down. "How's my nephew doing out there?" "He's doing great," Rachel said, nodding toward the court. "Coach says he's one of the sharpest players on the team." Anaya grinned. "Of course he is. That's your boy." Rachel chuckled, but her smile faded quickly. "He's starting to notice things, Anaya. You know, the way the world looks at him." Anaya nodded solemnly. "I figured that day would come soon. What are you telling him?" "The truth," Rachel said. "But it's hard. I want to prepare him, but I don't want him to lose his joy, you know? He's still so full of life." Anaya took a sip of her coffee, her expression thoughtful. "The world's gonna try to dim his light, Rach. But he's got you and Caleb. That's more than a lot of kids have." Rachel nodded, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. "It's just, every time I think I've prepared him for what's out there, I realize there's more I haven't told him. Like what to do if someone accuses him of something he didn't do, or how to act if he's ever stopped by the police." Anaya placed a hand on Rachel's arm. "You'll get through to him. He's a smart kid, and when he stumbles, you'll be there to pick him back up." After practice, Rachel walked with Micah to the car. He was buzzing with excitement, recounting the highlights of the scrimmage. "Coach said my defense was solid today," he said, throwing his gym bag into the back seat. "That's great, baby," Rachel said, smiling. "I'm proud of you." As they pulled out of the parking lot, Rachel's heart quickened. She had been mulling over something all evening, and now felt like the right time to address it. "Micah," she began, glancing at him in the rearview mirror, "can we talk about something important?" Micah looked up from his phone, sensing her serious tone. "Sure, what's up?" Rachel took a deep breath. "Do you know what to do if someone accuses you of something you didn't do? Or if you're ever stopped by the police?" Micah frowned. "What do you mean?" Rachel's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "I mean, if you're ever in a situation where someone blames you for something, maybe in a store or at school, you need to stay calm. Don't argue and don't get angry. Just tell them the truth and ask them to call me or your dad, okay?" Micah shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Why would someone think I did something wrong?" Rachel's voice softened. "Sometimes people make assumptions, Micah, not because of anything you've done, but because of how you look." Micah's brow furrowed. "That's stupid." "It is," Rachel agreed, her throat tightening, "but it's something you need to be ready for. And if you're ever stopped by the police—" She paused, the words catching in her throat. Micah looked at her, his eyes wide. "What do I do?" "You stay still," Rachel said firmly. "Keep your hands where they can see them. Be polite, even if they're not. And no matter what, don't argue. Just tell them your name and that you want to call me or your dad." Micah nodded slowly, his earlier excitement replaced by a quiet seriousness. "But I didn't do anything wrong." "I know, baby," Rachel said, glancing at him in the mirror. "And that's what makes it so unfair. But it's about keeping you safe. That's all I care about." Micah looked out the window, his reflection faint against the darkening sky. "Okay, Mom," he said quietly. "I'll remember." That night, Rachel sat in the living room, staring at the framed photos on the mantel. There was one of Micah as a toddler, his chubby hands clutching a toy airplane, his smile wide and carefree. Another showed him with Caleb at a Little League game, their matching grins lighting up the photo. Her heart ached at how quickly time was passing, how Micah was moving closer to the age where the world would stop seeing him as a child and start seeing him as a threat. Anaya's words from earlier echoed in her mind. "When he stumbles, you'll be there to pick him back up." Rachel closed her eyes, her resolve hardening. She couldn't control the world, but she could prepare her son. She could arm him with knowledge and strength and remind him every day of his worth. "Mom?" Rachel looked up to see Micah standing in the doorway, his pajamas rumpled, his expression hesitant. "Yeah, baby? Can you sit with me for a bit?" he asked. Rachel nodded, her chest tightening as she followed him upstairs. They sat on the edge of his bed, the quiet hum of the neighborhood outside the only sound. "Mom," Micah said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't want to be scared." Rachel pulled him into her arms, her hand smoothing his curls. "You don't have to be scared, Micah," she whispered. "You're brave and smart and so loved, and no matter what happens, your dad and I will always be here for you." Micah nodded against her chest, his small body leaning into hers. Rachel held him close, silently praying that her love would be enough to shield him from the shadows that lurked beyond their door. The talk at school. The crisp morning air carried the sound of kids laughing and chattering as Rachel walked Micah to school. He usually didn't need her to drop him off anymore. At 13, he was starting to assert his independence, but today was different. The email from Mr. Fletcher, Micah's history teacher, had arrived late last night. A minor incident, it said, involving a group project discussion that had grown heated. Micah's name was mentioned. Rachel's heart sank as they approached the school gates. Micah was uncharacteristically quiet, his usual enthusiasm replaced by a downcast gaze. "You okay, baby?" Rachel asked gently. Micah shrugged, gripping the straps of his backpack. "I didn't even do anything wrong, Mom. I swear." "I believe you," Rachel said, kneeling to meet his eyes. "But we're going to figure this out together, okay?" He nodded, and Rachel kissed his forehead before sending him toward the building. Inside the school's office, Rachel sat across from Mr. Fletcher and Ms. Morales, the school counselor. Mr. Fletcher was a wiry man with glasses that perched precariously on his nose, while Ms. Morales exuded warmth and calm. "Thanks for coming, Miss Harper," Mr. Fletcher began. "I wanted to discuss what happened yesterday. During a group project on civil rights, Micah and another student, Thomas, had a disagreement." Rachel folded her hands in her lap, her expression neutral. "What kind of disagreement?" "Well," Mr. Fletcher said, glancing at Ms. Morales for support, "Thomas expressed an opinion about segregation that Micah found offensive. Micah became visibly upset, and while he didn't raise his voice, his body language was intense." Rachel felt her jaw tighten. "Intense?" Ms. Morales jumped in. "We want to emphasize that Micah didn't do anything wrong. However, the situation escalated and Thomas claimed he felt threatened. We just want to make sure everyone feels safe in the classroom." Rachel's eyes narrowed. "So let me get this straight. My son felt offended by something said in class, something I assume about race, and instead of addressing what was said, you're focusing on how Micah reacted." Ms. Morales hesitated, clearly trying to tread carefully. "We understand how sensitive these topics can be, and we're not assigning blame. We're hoping to use this as a learning opportunity for all the students." Rachel leaned forward. "Did Micah say or do anything threatening? Or is this about the way he looks when he's upset?" Mr. Fletcher squirmed. "I wouldn't say threatening, but he was assertive." Rachel forced herself to remain calm. She'd been here before. This dance around language, that masked deeper biases. "Here's what I want to make clear," Rachel said firmly. "Micah is not a threat. He's a child. And if this classroom is discussing topics like segregation, the focus needs to be on fostering understanding, not policing emotions. Am I clear?" Ms. Morales nodded quickly. "Absolutely, Miss Harper. We'll make sure Micah feels supported. Perhaps he and Thomas could have a mediated conversation to clear the air?" Rachel exhaled, her frustration simmering but controlled. "Fine, but I want to be sure Micah isn't being unfairly singled out because of his appearance or the assumptions people make about boys like him." When Rachel picked Micah up after school, he looked relieved to see her. "Can we talk about it?" Rachel asked as they walked to the car. Micah sighed. "Thomas said segregation wasn't that bad because black people had their own schools and stuff. I told him that wasn't true and that it wasn't fair. Then he said I was getting scary." Rachel stopped walking, kneeling in front of him. "Baby, you weren't scary. You were standing up for what's right. That's a good thing." "But they didn't care what I said," Micah said, his voice cracking. "They just cared how I looked." Rachel's chest tightened as she wrapped her arms around him. "I know, Micah. I know how unfair that is. But you can't let that stop you from speaking your truth. You're strong, and you're smart, and your voice matters." Micah looked at her, his eyes glistening. "It doesn't feel like it matters." Rachel held his face in her hands, her own eyes filling with tears. "It does. And I will always be here to make sure the world knows it too." That evening, Rachel sat with Micah at the dining table, helping him with his history homework. The assignment was to write a reflection on what the civil rights movement meant to them. Micah chewed the end of his pencil, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Mom, can I write about what happened with Thomas?" "Of course, baby," Rachel said. "This is your chance to tell your story." Micah began to write, his words coming haltingly at first, then flowing freely. Rachel watched him, pride swelling in her chest. He was finding his voice, even in the face of injustice. Later that night, after Micah had gone to bed, Rachel sat alone in the living room. She thought about how far they'd come, and how far they still had to go. She pulled out her journal, something she hadn't done in months, and began to write. "Dear Micah, today you reminded me of what bravery looks like. You stood tall in a moment when the world wanted you to shrink. I know it wasn't easy, and it won't always feel fair, but you are part of something bigger, something beautiful. And I promise to walk beside you every step of the way. Rachel closed the journal, her resolve deepening. The road ahead was uncertain, but she knew one thing for sure. Micah wouldn't walk it alone. A seat at the table. Saturday mornings at Rachel's house were sacred. A time for pancakes, slow music on the speakers, and conversations that flowed as easily as syrup over buttered stacks. This Saturday, though, Rachel had invited an unexpected guest. Caleb's mother, Micah's grandmother, Miss Yvonne. Micah sat at the kitchen table, poking at his pancakes, while Miss Yvonne leaned back in her chair, sipping coffee. Her sharp eyes, framed by a pair of tortoiseshell glasses, were fixed on her grandson. She had that unique air of authority, unshakable, unyielding, but wrapped in love, that Micah both admired and tiptoed around. "Micah," Miss Yvonne said, breaking the silence, "your mom tells me you've had a tough week at school." Micah glanced at Rachel, who gave him a small nod. "It was okay," he mumbled. "Just stuff." "Stuff." Miss Yvonne raised an eyebrow. "Your mom wouldn't have invited me here if it were just stuff." Rachel chuckled, pouring more coffee into her mug. "Micah, your grandmother has a way of getting to the bottom of things. Might as well save yourself the trouble and tell her now." Micah sighed, putting his fork down. "This kid in my class said something dumb about segregation, and I told him he was wrong. Then he said I was scary." Miss Yvonne set her mug down, her expression softening but her eyes still keen. "Scary, huh? And how'd that make you feel?" Micah shrugged. "Mad, I guess, but also confused. I wasn't even yelling or anything. He just looked at me like I was a bad guy." Miss Yvonne leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Let me tell you something, baby. People have been looking at us that way for generations. Your granddaddy, God rest his soul, used to say it was because we carry too much power. People don't know what to do when they see power wrapped in skin like ours." Micah frowned. "But I wasn't trying to be powerful. I was just telling the truth." "That's the thing about truth," Miss Yvonne said, her voice steady. "It's powerful all by itself. And when you speak it, you make people uncomfortable. But that doesn't mean you stop. It means you learn how to carry it." Rachel watched the exchange quietly, marveling at her mother-in-law's wisdom. Yvonne had lived through the civil rights movement, marching in protests, sitting at lunch counters, and standing firm in the face of hate. Her presence was a grounding force, one Rachel often relied on, especially now. "You know," Yvonne continued, "when I was about your age, I got into trouble for speaking out too. A teacher said something awful about how black folks should know their place, and I told her she didn't know a thing about mine." Micah's eyes widened. "What happened?" "Oh, I got sent to the principal's office," Yvonne said, chuckling. "But when I got home, my mama told me I did the right thing. She said, 'If you know who you are, don't let anyone tell you different.' That stuck with me." Micah tilted his head. "So I did the right thing?" "You did," Yvonne said firmly. "But let me give you some advice. Next time someone says something like that, take a deep breath, look them in the eye, and then ask them, 'Why do you think that?' Make them explain themselves. 9 times out of 10, they won't have a good answer." Micah nodded slowly, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Okay, I'll try that." Later that day, after Miss Yvonne had left, Rachel and Micah went for a walk around the neighborhood. The autumn air was cool, and leaves crunched beneath their feet as they strolled past rows of brownstones and old trees. "You know Grandma's pretty awesome, right?" Rachel said, nudging Micah gently. "Yeah," Micah said, grinning. "She's like a superhero, but without the cape." Rachel laughed. "She's been through a lot, and she's passed that strength down to us. You've got it in you too." They walked in silence for a while, the sound of distant traffic filling the gaps. "Ma?" Micah said finally. "Yeah, baby?" "Do you ever get scared, like when you speak the truth?" Rachel paused, considering the question. "I do," she admitted. "Sometimes I'm scared people won't listen, or that they'll get mad. But then I think about what's more important, my fear or doing what's right." Micah looked thoughtful. "So, it's okay to be scared?" "Of course," Rachel said, wrapping an arm around his shoulder. "Bravery isn't about not being scared, it's about doing what you need to do, even when you are." That night, Rachel found Micah at the dining table, his head bent over a notebook. "What are you working on?" she asked, setting a glass of water beside him. "It's an essay," Micah said, not looking up. "I want to write about Grandma and what she said about truth and power, for extra credit in history." Rachel's heart swelled with pride. "That's a great idea. Need any help?" Micah shook his head. "Nah, I got it, but thanks." Rachel kissed the top of his head. "Okay, let me know if you change your mind." As she walked away, she glanced back at her son, hunched over his notebook, his pen moving furiously across the page. She felt a flicker of hope. Micah was finding his place in the world, one step at a time. And as he wrote, Rachel prayed that he would always have a seat at the table, one he built with his own truth and power. The neighborhood meeting. The hum of voices filled the community center as Rachel stepped inside, Micah trailing just behind her. Rows of folding chairs were set up in neat lines, and neighbors milled about, chatting in low tones. A flyer had gone out earlier in the week announcing the meeting, a gathering to address a recent spike in vandalism and minor thefts in the neighborhood. Rachel wasn't sure what to expect, but she knew she had to be here. Micah insisted on coming too, his curiosity piqued by the buzz of concern from other parents at school. "Stay close," Rachel murmured, placing a hand on Micah's shoulder as they found seats near the middle of the room. Micah nodded, his eyes darting around the room, taking in the scene. He spotted Mr. Johnson, the owner of the corner store, pacing near the front with a furrowed brow, and Miss Carter, the retired teacher who always waved to him on his way to school, sitting quietly in the corner. At the front of the room, a tall man with salt and pepper hair raised his hands for attention. He was flanked by two uniformed police officers, their presence making Rachel's stomach tighten. "Good evening, everyone," the man began. "For those who don't know me, I'm Greg Saunders, president of the Neighborhood Association. Thank you all for coming tonight." Rachel glanced at Micah, whose brow furrowed slightly. She could tell he was already picking up on the tension in the room. Mr. Saunders launched into an overview of the recent incidents: broken windows at the library, graffiti on the park walls, a string of stolen bikes. The officers nodded along, one of them scribbling notes in a small notebook. "We want to make sure our neighborhood stays safe," Saunders continued, "and that starts with all of us working together." Rachel stiffened when a woman in the front row raised her hand. "Have the police identified any suspects?" she asked. One of the officers, a younger man with a neatly trimmed beard, cleared his throat. "Not yet, ma'am, but we've received reports that the individuals involved are teenagers. Groups of young boys, mostly." The murmurs in the room grew louder, and Rachel could feel the shift in the air, a mix of frustration, fear, and, to her dismay, suspicion. "Teenagers?" Another voice piped up. "They're probably from outside the neighborhood." "Or they're from right here," someone else muttered. Rachel's chest tightened. She glanced at Micah, whose jaw was set, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. She knew what he was thinking, what she was thinking. When people said teenagers, they often meant boys who looked like him. When the floor opened for questions, Rachel's hand shot up before she could second-guess herself. "Yes, Miss," Saunders said, gesturing toward her. "Rachel Harper," she said, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "I think it's important that we don't jump to conclusions about who's responsible for these incidents. If we start labeling groups of kids without evidence, we risk alienating the very people we're trying to protect." A few people nodded, but others shifted uncomfortably. "I agree," Miss Carter said from her seat in the corner. "We need to approach this with fairness, not assumptions." The younger officer chimed in, his tone conciliatory. "We're not here to point fingers. Our goal is to increase awareness and work with the community to find solutions." "That's good to hear," Rachel said, her gaze unwavering. "Because we need to make sure that every child in this neighborhood feels safe, not just from vandalism, but from being unfairly targeted." As the meeting continued, Micah leaned closer to Rachel. "Mom," he whispered, "do they think it's us? Like kids like me?" Rachel placed a hand on his knee, squeezing gently. "Some people might," she whispered back, "but that doesn't make it true, and it's why we have to speak up." Micah nodded, his expression serious. Toward the end of the meeting, Saunders announced plans for a community patrol initiative, volunteers who would take turns walking the neighborhood in the evenings. Rachel immediately signed up, earning an approving nod from Miss Carter. As the crowd began to disperse, one of the officers approached Rachel and Micah. "Miss Harper," he said, "I just wanted to thank you for speaking up tonight. It's important to hear voices like yours." Rachel nodded politely, though her guard remained up. "Thank you, officer. I hope we can work together to make sure this is a safe space for everyone." The officer smiled faintly before moving on to another conversation. On the walk home, Micah was unusually quiet. "What's on your mind, baby?" Rachel asked. "I didn't like how they were talking," Micah said finally. "Like they didn't say it, but I could tell they were thinking about kids like me." Rachel sighed, her heart aching for him. "I know, Micah, it's not fair, but that's why it's so important for us to be part of these conversations, to make sure people see you for who you really are." Micah kicked at a loose pebble on the sidewalk. "Do you think they ever will?" Rachel stopped walking and turned to face him. "I do," she said firmly, "but it's going to take work, and it's not just about changing their minds. It's about you knowing your worth, no matter what anyone else thinks. Micah looked up at her, his face shadowed but resolute. I'm going to show them, he said, that I'm more than what they think. Rachel smiled, pride swelling in her chest. I know you will. That night, as Rachel tucked Micah into bed, he looked up at her with a question in his eyes. Mom, he said, do you think I can help? Like with the patrols? Rachel chuckled softly, brushing a curl from his forehead. Maybe when you're a little older. For now, your job is to keep being you. That's the best way to help. Micah nodded, his eyes growing heavy with sleep. Okay. Night, Mom. Good night, baby, Rachel whispered, kissing his forehead. As she turned off the light and closed his door, Rachel felt a mix of exhaustion and hope. The road ahead wasn't easy, but with every meeting, every conversation, and every small step, she knew they were building something stronger. For Micah and for everyone. The walk home. It was late afternoon when Micah decided to walk to the library. His science teacher had assigned a project on space exploration, and while he already had a stash of books on the topic at home, he wanted something new. The air was crisp, the streets quiet, and the walk would give him time to think. Be home before dark, Rachel had said, handing him a light jacket as he left. And stick to the main roads. Micah had nodded dutifully, though he couldn't help rolling his eyes a little. She worried too much, but he understood why. The library was peaceful, with its familiar scent of paper and ink. Micah found a seat near the back, where he could spread out his notebook and dive into the books he'd chosen. For a while, he was lost in the world of distant planets and rocket propulsion, scribbling notes and sketching designs for a spacecraft he imagined might one day explore the edges of the galaxy. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, Micah packed up his things and started the walk home. The streets were quieter now, the golden light of evening casting long shadows across the pavement. He stuck to the main road, just like his mom had said, his backpack bouncing lightly against his back. As he turned a corner near the park, he noticed two older boys standing by the basketball court. They were laughing and tossing a basketball back and forth, but something about their body language made Micah hesitate. He quickened his pace, hoping to pass unnoticed. Hey, little man, one of the boys called out, his voice teasing. Where are you headed in such a hurry? Micah stopped, his heart beating a little faster. Just going home, he said, keeping his tone even. At the taller of the two boys who wore a red hoodie, smirked. Got anything good in that bag? No, Micah said quickly. Just books, books. Books, the other boy, shorter but stockier, laughed. Man, what you need books for? You trying to be a nerd or something? Micah clenched the straps of his backpack. I'm just trying to get home. The taller boy stepped closer, his smirk fading into something harder. Relax, man. We're just messing with you. Micah didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the ground, remembering what his mom always said. Stay calm. Don't escalate. Let him go, Marcus, a voice called out from behind them. Micah turned to see Mr. Rowland, the barber from Caleb's shop, standing at the edge of the park. His broad frame and no-nonsense expression made the two boys immediately take a step back. Just talking, the boy in the red hoodie mumbled. Ain't no big deal. Well, talk somewhere else, Mr. Rowland said, crossing his arms. This one's with me. The boys exchanged a look before muttering something under their breath and walking away. Mr. Rowland waited until they were out of sight before turning to Micah. You okay, kid? He asked. Micah nodded, though his hands were still trembling slightly. Thanks, Mr. Rowland. The older man nodded, his expression softening. You handled yourself well. Didn't let him get to you. That's good. Micah shrugged, unsure how to respond. I just didn't want any trouble. That's smart, Mr. Rowland said. But you shouldn't have to deal with stuff like that on your own. Come on, I'll walk you the rest of the way. As they walked, Mr. Rowland kept the conversation light, asking Micah about school and his library trip. By the time they reached Micah's block, the tension in his chest had eased. You tell your mom about this, you hear? Mr. Rowland said as they stopped in front of his house. She'll want to know. Micah nodded. Thanks again? Anytime. Mr. Rowland said, giving him a reassuring pat on the shoulder before heading off down the street. Inside, Rachel was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of chili. She turned when she heard the door open, her smile fading as she saw the look on Micah's face. What happened? She asked, setting the spoon down. Micah hesitated, then told her everything, about the boys at the park, about Mr. Rowland stepping in. Rachel's expression shifted from concern to anger, though she kept her voice calm. Are you okay? She asked, pulling him into a hug. I'm fine, Micah said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. It wasn't that bad. It shouldn't have happened at all, Rachel said firmly, pulling back to look at him. I'm glad Mr. Rowland was there, but this is exactly why I worry, Micah. You did everything right, and still. She trailed off, taking a deep breath. I'm proud of you, she said after a moment. You kept your cool, and you came home safe. That's what matters. Micah nodded, though he could see the worry etched in her face. Mom, I'm okay. Really? Rachel smiled faintly, brushing a hand through his curls. I know, baby, She stopped herself, shaking her head. Let's eat. You must be hungry after all that. Later that night, as Micah lay in bed, he thought about what had happened. He wasn't scared anymore, but he felt something else. Frustration, maybe, or anger. Why did he have to deal with this? Why couldn't he just walk home without being stopped, questioned, or judged? His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock on the door. Rachel peeked inside, holding a cup of hot chocolate. Thought you might want this, she said, setting the mug on his nightstand. Thanks, Micah said, sitting up. Rachel sat on the edge of the bed, her expression thoughtful. You know, Micah, she said, the world isn't always fair, and sometimes it's going to make you feel small. But you're not small. You're bigger than any of this. Micah nodded, her words sinking in. I know, Mom, and if you ever feel like the world's too heavy, you come to me, okay? Rachel said, her voice steady. We'll figure it out together. Micah smiled, the warmth of the hot chocolate spreading through him. Okay, Mom. As Rachel kissed his forehead and left the room, Micah felt a spark of determination take root. He didn't know exactly how, but he was going to show the world who he was, on his own terms. Strength in numbers. The days following the incident at the park left Rachel more determined than ever to prepare Micah for the challenges ahead. She started attending every community patrol meeting, dragging Anaya with her. Caleb joined occasionally, his presence bolstering her resolve. The neighborhood was beginning to feel like a patchwork of support and tension, with some residents eager to work together while others clung to old prejudices. Micah, for his part, became quieter but more focused. He spent hours in his room sketching plans for his science project and reading about famous black scientists like Katherine Johnson and Neil deGrasse Tyson. One evening, he came to Rachel with a question. Mom, he said, holding one of his sketches, can I put something about justice in my project? Like how people exploring space is kind of like us trying to make things fair down here. Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with pride. I think that's a brilliant idea, baby. Space and justice, they're both about reaching for something bigger. Micah grinned. Cool, I'm going to make it the best project ever. The science fair. The school's science fair was a bustling event. The gym transformed into a maze of cardboard displays, blinking lights, and eager students explaining their work to parents and judges. Micah's project stood out. A sleek, colorful model of a spacecraft he'd designed himself, complete with a detailed report on how exploration could inspire equity. Rachel and Caleb stood by his table, beaming as Micah presented his ideas. Miss Morales, the school counselor, stopped by and listened intently as Micah explained his connection between space exploration and social justice. That's very insightful, Micah, she said, genuinely impressed. You've managed to combine science and heart. I'm proud of you. Micah glowed under her praise, but what happened next surprised everyone. Nice work, a familiar voice said. Rachel turned to see Thomas, the boy from the civil rights discussion, standing with his parents. He looked sheepish, but his words were sincere. Your project's really cool. Thanks, Micah said, his tone cautious but polite. Thomas lingered for a moment. I didn't mean to upset you in class, he added quietly. I guess I just didn't get it, but I think I do now. Rachel exchanged a glance with Caleb, both of them stunned. Micah nodded, his expression softening. Thanks. That means a lot. For Rachel, the moment was small but monumental. A sign that change, however slow, was possible. The community comes together. The following week, the Neighborhood Patrol Initiative officially launched. Rachel, Caleb, and Anaya joined the first evening walk, along with Mr. Rowland and a handful of other residents. They carried flashlights and wore reflective vests, their footsteps echoing through the streets as they walked in pairs. It wasn't long before the patrol began making a difference. By simply being visible, they deterred the vandalism that had plagued the area. But more importantly, the walks fostered connections. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now stopped to chat, and kids playing on porches waved enthusiastically as the patrol passed by. Micah sometimes joined them, his youthful energy bringing levity to the group. On one particularly cold night, he walked alongside Mr. Rowland, peppering him with questions about the barbershop and his own childhood. You remind me of myself at your age, Mr. Rowland said, grinning. Curious, always asking questions. Keep that up, Micah. It'll take you far. A test of courage. One evening during a patrol, Rachel and Caleb noticed a group of teenagers hanging out near the park. Their voices were loud, their laughter carrying through the crisp night air. Rachel hesitated, memories of Micah's encounter flashing through her mind. Let's talk to them, Caleb said, his tone even. Not accuse, just connect. Rachel nodded, her heart pounding as they approached the group. Hey there, she said, her voice calm. Everything okay? The teenagers looked up, their expressions wary. One of them, a tall boy with a baseball cap, stepped forward. Yeah, we're good. We're just out walking, Caleb said, making sure everything's cool in the neighborhood. You all live around here? The boy nodded. Yeah, we're not causing trouble or anything. Rachel smiled gently. I didn't think you were, just wanted to say hi. The tension eased, and soon the conversation turned to school, sports, and future plans. As Rachel and Caleb walked away, she felt a wave of relief. Building trust, she realized, was as important as keeping watch. The letter, months later, Micah's teacher handed him a sealed envelope during class. This is for your parents, Mr. Fletcher said, smiling, but I wanted to tell you personally how proud I am of the progress you've made. That evening, Rachel opened the letter while Micah sat nervously at the table. It was an invitation to a district-wide awards ceremony, recognizing Micah for his science fair project and its message of inclusion and innovation. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she read the words. Micah, she said, her voice thick with emotion, this is amazing. I'm so proud of you. Micah grinned. Really? Really, Rachel said. You've worked so hard and people are starting to see what I've always known. You're going to change the world. Reaching for the stars, the award ceremony was a moment of celebration for the whole family. Rachel, Caleb, and Miss Yvonne sat in the audience, cheering as Micah accepted his certificate. Even Anaya was there, snapping pictures and shouting, "That's my nephew." As Micah stood at the podium, clutching his award, he took a deep breath. I made this project because I believe exploration isn't just about going to space. It's about finding new ways to understand each other down here on Earth, and I hope we can keep reaching together. The audience erupted in applause, and Rachel's heart felt full to bursting. In that moment, she saw not just the boy Micah was, but the man he was becoming. Building a better tomorrow. Years later, Micah would look back on that time as a turning point. The lessons his family and community taught him became the foundation for a life dedicated to justice, science, and bridging divides. He went on to study aerospace engineering, but his passion for social change remained at the forefront of his work. Rachel, now a pillar of the neighborhood association, continued to fight for equity and connection. And while the world still had its challenges, the seeds they'd planted grew into something strong, something hopeful. Because in the end, it wasn't just about surviving a turbulent world. It was about saving it. One voice, one truth, one step at a time. In the quiet moments after the applause faded and life returned to its steady rhythm, Rachel often reflected on the journey that had brought her and Micah to this point. It was a story of resilience, of standing firm in the face of fear and injustice, and of daring to hope for a better world even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Along the way, she learned that the greatest gift she could give her son wasn't just protection, but the tools to thrive. Courage, self-awareness, and an unshakable belief in his own worth. Micah's growth was her greatest triumph, a testament to the power of love, community, and the unyielding pursuit of justice. And as she watched him reach for the stars, both figuratively and literally, Rachel felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that together they had turned life's turbulence into a foundation for something enduring and beautiful. Thank you for watching the story. If you find the video interesting and meaningful, please comment 1 and subscribe to the channel TMY Stories. We will bring many interesting and meaningful stories to our audience. Once again, thank you everyone for listening.